The first warning was not the earthquake. It was the sea. Long before the walls began to crack, long before towers leaned over crowded streets, the water inside the great harbor pulled away from the land. Ships settled into the mud. Bronze anchors scraped across the exposed floor. Fish twisted beneath a sky suddenly filled with birds. Along the quays, sailors stared at the empty channel and understood that something impossible was happening. Then the horizon rose. A dark wall appeared beyond the outer ring of the city. At first it looked like a storm. Then it grew higher and higher. The people of Atlantis had built temples plated with precious metal. They had cut canals across a fertile plain. They had raised bridges over circles of water and stone. Their kings believed their empire could not be challenged by any army on earth. But the thing moving toward them was not an army. The ground split beneath the royal island. Statues fell from the temple of Poseidon. Horses screamed inside flooded stables. In the lower districts, families ran toward the bridges, only to find the roads breaking apart beneath their feet. The sea rushed through the gates, carrying ships into houses and tearing stone from stone. Fires burned on the hills while rain and ash turned the daylight black. And somewhere above the city, perhaps in the palace, perhaps on the steps of the great temple, the rulers of Atlantis finally faced the truth. Their power had not saved them. Their wealth had not saved them. Their walls had not saved them. Before the next sunrise, the island was gone. At least, that is the story. For more than 2,000 years, people have searched for the place beneath the water. They have placed it in the Atlantic Ocean, the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, the Sahara, the Arctic, Antarctica, and almost every sea between them. Explorers have claimed to see roads on the ocean floor. Writers have connected Atlantis to pyramids, ancient floods, vanished peoples, forgotten technologies, and civilizations that supposedly existed before recorded history. Every generation has remade the lost island in its own image. But the original Atlantis was stranger than the modern legend. It was not described as a peaceful paradise destroyed by accident. It was not a city of crystals, flying machines, or supernatural science. It was a powerful empire that became corrupted, crossed the sea, enslaved nations, and attempted to conquer the ancient world. Its enemy was an idealized Athens that should not have existed in the age Plato assigned to it. Its history came through a chain of storytellers that cannot be verified, and the most detailed account of its fate ends before the punishment even begins. The final sentence is missing, not damaged, not washed away, missing because Plato stopped writing. That unfinished sentence is one of the reasons Atlantis survived. Had Plato completed the story, he might have explained too much. He might have made the lesson obvious. He might have closed the door that later generations forced open. Instead, he left Atlantis at the edge of destruction, while Zeus gathered the gods and prepared to speak. Then silence. To understand why the silence became louder than the story, we have to return to Athens in the 4th century before Christ. Not the legendary Athens that defeated Atlantis, but the real city in which Plato lived. It was a city haunted by its own greatness. Athens had once led a powerful maritime alliance. Its fleets had dominated the Aegean. Tribute from other Greek cities had filled its treasury. Its temples rose above the streets in brilliant stone. Its citizens celebrated democracy, drama, philosophy, and military victory. Yet beneath that glory was ambition, coercion, and war. The alliance Athens claimed to protect had become an empire many of its subjects feared. Then came disaster. The long Peloponnesian War against Sparta exhausted the Greek world. Athens suffered plague, political violence, military defeat, and civil conflict. Its most ambitious expedition, a massive invasion of Sicily, ended in catastrophe. Thousands died or were captured. Ships were destroyed. Confidence became humiliation. A city that had believed in its own exceptional destiny discovered that power could disappear faster than anyone imagined. Plato grew up in the shadow of that collapse. He was born into an aristocratic family, surrounded by politics, war, and arguments over how a state should be governed. His teacher Socrates questioned the most respected men of Athens and challenged the city to examine itself. In 399 before Christ, the democracy condemned Socrates to death. Plato never forgot it. Much of his life became a search for the answer to a dangerous question. What makes a society just? And what causes a society to destroy itself? Atlantis enters history inside that search. The name appears in two of Plato's dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, probably written late in his life. These works are not travel records. They are philosophical conversations. Their speakers discuss the ideal state, the structure of the universe, the origins of human beings, the movement of the heavens, the nature of matter, and the repeated destruction of civilizations. Atlantis is introduced not as an isolated adventure, but as part of a much larger design. The conversation begins after Socrates has described a model society. He wants to see this ideal state in motion. A city may sound perfect in theory, but what happens when it faces danger? How would its citizens behave in war? Could discipline and justice survive against a stronger enemy? Critias, one of the speakers, says he knows a story that can answer the question. He calls it ancient and true. Those words have echoed for centuries. Critias claims the story came from Solon, one of the most respected lawgivers in Athenian memory. Solon had lived roughly 2 centuries before Plato. He was a poet, statesman, and reformer credited with reshaping Athenian law. According to the dialogue, Solon traveled to Egypt and visited the city of Sais in the Nile Delta. There, priests told him that the Greeks were children in their knowledge of the distant past. The insult was not about intelligence. It was about memory. The priests explained that human civilization had been destroyed many times by fire and water. When fire came from the heavens, people living in the mountains survived while cities on the plains vanished. When great floods came, people in the highlands survived while coastal populations were swept away. Egypt, protected by the behavior of the Nile and by its long tradition of record-keeping, had preserved events the Greeks had forgotten. This idea would have been powerful to Plato's audience. Greek communities knew earthquakes, tsunamis, fires, and sudden ruin. They lived among the remains of older cultures. They told stories of floods and lost ages. They also respected Egypt as an ancient civilization whose temples seemed to reach far deeper into time than their own written memory. The priest at Sais then tells Solon that Athens once performed the greatest deed of all, but no Athenian remembered it. 9,000 years before Solon, the priest says, a mighty power emerged from an island beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the ancient name usually associated with the Strait of Gibraltar. This island was called Atlantis. From it, a confederation of kings ruled other islands and parts of a distant mainland. Their empire extended into the Mediterranean world. They controlled lands in North Africa as far as Egypt and in Europe as far as the region of Tyrrhenia in Italy. Then Atlantis attacked. One by one, peoples within the strait were threatened with conquest and slavery. Alliances failed. Nations fell away. At last, ancient Athens stood alone. This was not the Athens Plato knew. It was a heroic city reconstructed from his political imagination. Its warriors were disciplined. Its citizens placed duty above wealth. It possessed the virtues Plato believed a properly ordered society required. And when the Atlantean Empire advanced, this forgotten Athens defeated it, freed the conquered peoples, and saved the lands inside the Pillars of Heracles. Then came the catastrophe. Plato gives the destruction only a few lines in the Timaeus. After the war, he says, violent earthquakes and floods arrived. In a single terrible day and night, the warriors of Athens were swallowed by the earth, while Atlantis sank into the sea. The waters beyond the strait became difficult to cross because of mud left by the vanished island. The description is brief, almost brutally brief. An empire rises, invades, loses, and disappears in the space of a few sentences. There is no survivor's account. No last king standing on a tower. No child carried from the flood. No expedition sent to search the ruins. But Plato was not finished. In the Critias, he returned to the story and opened the gates of Atlantis. The second dialogue begins with a request for patience. Critias admits that speaking about gods is easier than speaking about human beings. People accept an imperfect image of a divine world because they do not know exactly what that world should look like. But when a speaker describes human life, listeners become strict judges. They recognize what feels wrong. It is almost as though Plato is warning the audience to watch carefully. Then Critias begins again, not with destruction, but with division. In the distant past, he says, the gods divided the earth among themselves. Athena and Hephaestus received Athens. Poseidon, god of the sea, received Atlantis. At the center of the island stood a low mountain surrounded by a broad and fertile plain. On that mountain lived a mortal couple. Their daughter was named Cleito. When her parents died, Poseidon desired her and enclosed the hill where she lived. He created alternating rings of sea and land around it, circles cut so perfectly that no human could easily enter. There, Cleito gave birth to 5 pairs of twin sons, 10 princes, 10 future kingdoms. Poseidon divided the island among them. The eldest, Atlas, became the supreme king, and the island and surrounding ocean took their names from him. His twin was called Gadiris in Greek, a name associated in the text with the region near the entrance to the Atlantic. The other brothers received territories of their own, but all remained bound beneath the authority of Atlas and his descendants. This is where the Atlantis most people imagine begins to appear, not beneath the sea, but under construction. For generations, the kings transformed Poseidon's sacred rings into the center of an imperial capital. They cut a canal from the ocean to the outer circle, allowing ships to sail directly toward the royal island. They bridged the rings of water. They roofed passages so vessels could move below. They surrounded each circle with walls and covered those walls with different metals. Brass-like material on one ring, tin on another, and on the innermost wall a mysterious substance called orichalcum, which Plato says shone with a fiery light. No one knows exactly what Plato meant by orichalcum. Later writers used the word in different ways. It may have referred to a copper alloy, perhaps something resembling brass. In modern fantasy, it became a magical metal. In Plato's account, its importance is not supernatural. It is a symbol of extraordinary wealth, second in value only to gold. At the heart of the city stood the temple of Poseidon and Cleito. A golden wall enclosed the sacred ground. Inside were statues dedicated by the 10 royal families. The central image showed Poseidon driving a chariot drawn by winged horses, surrounded by sea creatures. The roof was described as ivory decorated with gold, silver, and orichalcum. The walls, pillars, and floor glittered with metal. Outside the temple stood statues of kings, queens, and descendants, offerings accumulated over generations of rule. The spectacle must have seemed overwhelming. But Plato does not allow the city to become pure fantasy. He describes infrastructure: water, roads, harbors, barracks, shipyards, baths. 2 springs rose from the royal island, one warm and one cold. The Atlanteans built pools around them, some open to the sky and others covered for winter. Separate baths served kings, ordinary citizens, women, and horses. The water flowed into gardens and sacred groves. Channels carried it outward toward the rings and into the larger city. Beyond the royal center, the harbor became a forest of masts. Merchants arrived from every territory under Atlantean control. Sailors crowded the docks. Workshops rang with the sound of tools. The narrow entrances between the rings created defensible corridors, while walls and towers watched every approach. Plato says the noise continued day and night. Voices, traffic, hammering, ships, and animals packed into a city swollen by wealth and power. Atlantis was beautiful. Atlantis was organized. Atlantis was also becoming dangerous. Because the rings did not merely protect a sacred home. They concentrated authority. Every canal led inward. Every wall drew the eye toward the kings. Every ship entering from the sea passed through controlled passages before reaching the center. The city's design was a map of its politics. Power at the edges flowed toward one island. And on that island stood a temple to the god who had given the dynasty its right to rule. The Atlanteans believed their order came from the divine. For a long time, Plato says, that belief restrained them. It would not restrain them forever. Beyond the capital stretched the landscape that made the empire possible. Plato describes Atlantis as a vast island rich in almost everything its people required. Forests supplied timber for ships and buildings. The earth held metals, including the prized orichalcum. Wild and domesticated animals lived across the country. Elephants, he says, were numerous. Fruits, grains, herbs, and fragrant plants grew in abundance. Some details sound familiar to the Mediterranean world. Others seem designed to make Atlantis feel larger, richer, and more distant than any ordinary Greek state. The most important region was the Great Plain south of the capital. It was rectangular, protected from northern winds by mountains, and open toward the sea. Plato gives it enormous measurements, 3,000 stadia in length and 2,000 in width. The precise modern conversion depends on which ancient stadion is used, but any reasonable calculation produces an area of extraordinary size. Around the plain ran a vast ditch. Straight canals crossed the land at regular intervals, carrying water and allowing timber and crops to be transported toward the city. The description has fascinated generations of readers because it sounds less like a dream and more like a survey. There are distances, directions, rings, channels, military districts, administrative rules. Plato tells us how land was divided and how soldiers were supplied. This precision creates the impression of memory, as though a real map lies somewhere behind the words. Yet precision in an ancient story is not proof. Plato often used numbers to express order. Greek authors gave exact dimensions to legendary structures. Sacred architecture, political systems, and cosmic models were frequently described through geometry. Atlantis is built from circles, rectangles, ratios, paired kings, and carefully assigned territories. Its numerical detail may be there not because someone measured the island, but because Plato wanted the island to represent a system that looked perfectly controlled. The plain was divided into thousands of allotments. Each district had obligations to the state. It was expected to provide men, horses, chariots, weapons, and sailors. The numbers in the Critias are so large that the total force would have exceeded what any Bronze Age island could realistically maintain. The effect is clear even if the arithmetic is symbolic or exaggerated. Atlantis could mobilize on a scale no ordinary city could match. Its kings ruled separately, but they were joined by law and blood. Their relationship was preserved through commandments said to have been written by Poseidon himself on a pillar of orichalcum inside the temple. At regular intervals, the 10 rulers gathered to judge disputes and renew their bond. Before they judged one another, they performed a sacrifice. Bulls were allowed to move freely inside the sacred enclosure. The kings entered without iron weapons. Using wooden clubs and ropes, they hunted one of the animals and brought it to the pillar. There they killed it, allowing its blood to fall across the inscription of the law. They burned parts of the sacrifice, mixed wine in a bowl, and swore to obey Poseidon's commands. Each king drank from the mixture and poured a portion into the fire. Then, dressed in dark blue robes, they sat in the ashes and judged cases through the night. It is one of the most vivid scenes in the entire story. Fire reflecting on metal walls. 10 rulers in blue. Blood on the law. A dark temple after sunset. Kings promising not to take up arms against one another and agreeing to help if any member of the royal family faced rebellion. The ceremony reveals the central tension of Atlantis. Its rulers possess enormous freedom, but their freedom is supposed to remain under law. They are wealthy, but they are supposed to treat wealth as a burden rather than a purpose. They descend from a god, but part of them remains human. At first, according to Plato, the divine part was strong. The early kings showed self-control. They cared for virtue more than luxury. They treated their prosperity lightly because they understood that friendship and excellence could not be purchased with gold. Their wealth increased precisely because they did not worship it. Their empire expanded, but its founders were not yet slaves to power. This is the Atlantis modern popular culture often freezes in time. Wise rulers, elegant cities, abundant resources, and a people living close to the divine. But Plato's story does not stop there. Generation after generation, the descendants of Poseidon married mortals. The divine inheritance within them became diluted. The human element grew stronger. Their judgment weakened. To ordinary observers, they still appeared magnificent. They still possessed palaces, fleets, metals, fields, and armies. They still looked like the most fortunate people in the world. Yet from a wiser point of view, Plato says, they had become ugly. They could no longer measure what had true value. They mistook excess for greatness. They mistook domination for strength. They mistook the appearance of power for the possession of virtue. This is the real catastrophe of Atlantis. The earthquake comes later. The first collapse happens inside the rulers. Plato had watched political communities justify ambition in the language of honor. He had seen men praise freedom while pursuing empire. He knew how easily a city could tell itself that wealth proved wisdom, that victory proved justice, and that power proved divine favor. Atlantis embodies that self-deception on an impossible scale. Its empire reached across islands and coasts. Tribute and resources flowed toward the capital. Its naval power connected the outer ocean to the Mediterranean. The kings who once treated wealth as secondary now began to hunger for more. At some point, they turned east. Plato gives no speech announcing the invasion. He names no single tyrant who corrupts the others. There is no Atlantean villain with a face. The choice seems collective, almost inevitable. A system built to accumulate power eventually seeks a larger field in which to use it. Atlantis already controlled territory outside its central island. It had possessions in the ocean and on a distant continent. Within the Pillars of Heracles, it ruled lands in Africa and Europe. But the empire wanted everything that remained. The Athenians stood in its path. To modern ears, the war sounds like a clash between a lost superpower and a small Greek city. But the geography of Plato's story is moral before it is military. Atlantis is rich, enormous, naval, aggressive, and ruled by hereditary kings. Ancient Athens is restrained, disciplined, land-centered, defensive, and organized according to a version of Plato's ideal state. Atlantis has more. Athens is better. The contrast is so carefully constructed that the historical problem becomes unavoidable. The Athens Plato describes could not have existed 9,000 years before Solon. That date would place the war near the end of the last ice age, thousands of years before cities, writing, bronze weapons, trireme fleets, or anything resembling classical Athens appeared in Greece. The defenders of a historical Atlantis have offered many explanations. Some suggest the number was mistranslated and that 9,000 years should be 900. Others argue that Egyptian calendar units were misunderstood. Some say Plato used symbolic time. Some accept the date and propose an unknown Ice Age civilization. But the dialogue itself gives no sign that the number is a simple copyist's error. The extreme antiquity serves a purpose. It removes the ideal Athens from ordinary history. It places the conflict in a forgotten age preserved only by Egypt. It allows Plato to build a political example without being trapped by the inconvenient details of real Athenian institutions. The battle itself is barely described. We are told that Athens first led other Greek peoples. Then its allies abandoned it. Alone, the city faced the Atlantean power. Through courage and skill, the Athenians defeated the invaders, prevented the enslavement of those still free, and liberated peoples already conquered. It should have been the climax. Instead, Plato hurries past it. No battlefield is named. No general gives orders. No formation breaks. No king falls. The victory exists mainly as evidence that the just city can overcome the stronger empire. And then justice becomes tragedy. The same catastrophe that destroys Atlantis also swallows the Athenian warriors. Their victory survives only in the Egyptian account. The defenders save the world inside the strait, but they do not return home to receive glory. Memory itself is broken by disaster. This gives the story a darker edge than a simple moral fable. The innocent are not fully spared. The virtuous city wins, yet its army disappears into the earth. Atlantis is punished, but the catastrophe is so vast that it erases the heroes as well as the aggressors. History is left without witnesses. The deed becomes greater because no one remembers it. Why would Plato create such an ending? Perhaps because he knew that justice does not guarantee safety. A good society may still suffer. A brave person may still die. Virtue is not valuable because it always produces comfort. It is valuable because it determines who people become when comfort disappears. Atlantis faces danger after losing its moral center. Athens faces danger while preserving its own. One civilization is defeated before the water arrives. The other remains itself, even in destruction. The Critias seems ready to explain how the gods respond to the Atlantean decline. Zeus, ruler of the gods and guardian of law, recognizes that the people of Atlantis have become corrupted by prosperity. He decides to punish them so that suffering may restore order. He gathers all the gods in his most honored dwelling, the place from which he can see everything that comes into being. Then Zeus speaks, or he was meant to. The surviving text ends at the moment he calls the assembly to attention. There is no account of the divine debate, no description of the sentence, no detailed fall of the city. The flood and earthquake are known only from the earlier summary in the Timaeus. The Critias stops mid-story, and the dialogue that may have followed, often called the Hermocrates by later speculation, does not survive and may never have been written. The absence transformed Atlantis. Readers inherited a city with streets, metals, harbors, baths, fields, kings, and laws. They inherited its corruption and its coming punishment. But they did not inherit Plato's full conclusion, so they supplied their own. Some imagined the last day as divine judgment. Others pictured a natural disaster remembered through myth. Some treated Atlantis as a warning about Athens. Others treated it as a genuine historical report. And once the search for a physical island began, every unexplained ruin and every drowned coastline became a possible fragment of the missing ending. The mystery grew because the evidence was both rich and narrow. Everything comes from Plato. No Egyptian inscription known today tells the Atlantis story. No surviving work by Solon mentions it. No earlier Greek author describes an island empire by that name beyond the pillars of Heracles. The chain from Egyptian priests to Solon, from Solon to his relatives, and from those relatives to Critias appears only inside Plato's dialogues. That does not automatically prove invention. Ancient records disappear. Oral traditions change. Entire libraries have been lost. The absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. But when an extraordinary story appears for the first time in the work of a philosopher who regularly created myths to explore moral and political ideas, caution is not cynicism. It is necessary. Plato was not writing a modern history book. His dialogues mix argument, drama, symbolism, and invented conversation. Socrates appears as a speaker even when the discussions cannot be transcripts of real events. Myths of the afterlife, cosmic cycles, ideal cities, and divine judgment are used to make philosophical claims visible. Atlantis fits this method almost perfectly. It is a political thought experiment wearing the clothes of ancient history. Yet that answer, convincing as it is to many classicists, does not explain every feature that later readers found compelling. Plato may have invented Atlantis, but invention rarely comes from emptiness. Writers build with remembered materials: wars, earthquakes, harbors, rituals, foreign stories, landscapes, and the ruins of real cities. The deeper question is not simply whether Atlantis existed exactly as Plato described it. The deeper question is what realities he may have transformed. And to answer that, we must look at the world around him. A world in which cities really did vanish, islands really did explode, armies really did drown, and empires really did discover that the sea could erase human confidence in a single night. Less than 20 years before Plato likely wrote the Atlantis dialogues, a Greek city disappeared beneath water and mud. Its name was Helike. Helike stood on the southern shore of the Gulf of Corinth. It was an important religious center associated with Poseidon, the god who would later rule Atlantis in Plato's story. In the winter of 373 before Christ, witnesses reported strange signs. Animals fled. Then an earthquake struck during the night. The land dropped. Water rushed inland. Buildings collapsed, and the city was overwhelmed. Ancient accounts describe bodies lying among the ruins and ships sailing above the submerged site. The precise details became embellished, but the destruction itself was real. Archaeological work in the region has identified remains associated with the ancient city and evidence of catastrophic flooding and seismic activity. For Plato and his contemporaries, Helike was not remote prehistory. It was recent news. A city dedicated to Poseidon had been destroyed by earthquake and sea. The parallel with Atlantis is impossible to ignore. It does not mean Helike was Atlantis. Helike lay inside Greece, not beyond Gibraltar. It was far smaller than Plato's empire, but its fate may have provided the emotional force behind the image of a proud city swallowed in a single night. Plato also knew another catastrophe, this one created not by nature, but by ambition. In 415 before Christ, Athens launched an enormous expedition against Syracuse in Sicily. The plan was bold, expensive, and disastrous. The Athenians sent ships, soldiers, cavalry, and commanders across the sea, expecting to expand their influence. Political conflict weakened the leadership. The campaign stalled. Syracuse resisted. Reinforcements failed to reverse the situation. The Athenian fleet became trapped in the harbor and was defeated. Retreating troops were hunted down. Many prisoners were confined in stone quarries, where hunger, exposure, and disease killed them. The expedition became a symbol of imperial overreach. Athens had sailed west to conquer a powerful island-based enemy. Instead, its fleet was destroyed, and the war accelerated the city's collapse. Atlantis reverses the direction. In Plato's tale, the great Western naval power sails east to conquer Athens. This time Athens resists, and the invader is defeated. The story may be read as an imaginative correction of history, the Athens that Plato wished had existed, facing the kind of empire Athens itself had become. There are other reflections. The Atlantean Empire resembles the Persian Wars in reverse. In the 5th century before Christ, the vast Persian Empire invaded Greece. Greek cities faced a power with greater resources and wider territory. Athens played a leading role in resistance. The victory later became central to Athenian identity. Plato's Atlantis combines features of a maritime Athens, a royal Persia, and a wealthy Western power. It is not a portrait of one state. It is a warning assembled from several. Plato's own experience in Sicily may also have shaped the story. He traveled to Syracuse, where he became involved with rulers who controlled a rich and fortified city. Plato hoped philosophy might guide political power. The results were frustrating and dangerous. Court politics, suspicion, and personal ambition proved stronger than his ideals. Some scholars have noticed that the ringed harbors, massive defenses, and royal landscape of Atlantis may echo features associated with Syracuse and other great ports. Again, resemblance is not identity. But this is how literary creation often works. A recent earthquake provides the destruction. A failed invasion provides the moral. Persia provides imperial scale. Syracuse provides royal power and harbor architecture. Egypt provides ancient authority. Myth provides Poseidon and Atlas. Philosophy binds everything together. Then there is the most famous candidate of all, Santorini. Today the Greek island is known for white buildings clinging to cliffs above a blue caldera. In the 2nd millennium before Christ, it was called Thera and formed part of the Bronze Age Aegean world. On the southern part of the island stood a settlement now known as Akrotiri. Its people lived in multi-story buildings decorated with frescoes. They traded across the sea. They stored grain, used advanced drainage, and participated in the wider culture linked to Minoan Crete. Then the volcano awakened. The eruption of Thera, usually dated to the 17th or 16th century before Christ, was one of the largest volcanic events in recorded human prehistory. Earthquakes damaged buildings. Ash fell. Massive explosions reshaped the island. The central part of Thera collapsed into a caldera. Tsunamis crossed the Aegean and struck nearby coasts. Akrotiri was buried beneath volcanic material, preserving walls, pottery, tools, and vivid paintings. Unlike Pompeii, the site has produced no large collection of human bodies. The inhabitants may have recognized warning signs and evacuated before the final eruption. Their ultimate fate remains uncertain. The similarities to Atlantis seem irresistible. A sophisticated island society, maritime wealth, beautiful architecture, a catastrophic destruction involving earthquake, sea, and sudden darkness. A connection with the Minoan world, whose palace culture appeared astonishingly advanced when archaeologists began uncovering it in the modern age. This theory became especially popular in the 20th century. Some researchers proposed that memories of the Thera eruption and the decline of Minoan Crete traveled through generations until Plato transformed them into Atlantis. But the differences are just as important. Thera lies within the Mediterranean, not beyond the Pillars of Heracles. The eruption occurred roughly 1,000 years before Plato, not 9,000 years before Solon. The island was not larger than Libya and Asia as Greeks understood those regions. Minoan Crete was a major Bronze Age power, but there is no evidence that it launched Plato's Atlantean invasion against a prehistoric Athens. The city plan at Akrotiri does not match the concentric capital in the Critias. Most damaging of all, the chronology does not produce a simple collapse of Minoan civilization. The eruption was devastating, but Minoan culture continued afterward. The palaces on Crete did not all vanish in the same event. The later decline involved a complex sequence of destruction, political change, and Mycenaean expansion. Thera may have weakened networks, damaged fleets, or disrupted agriculture. but it cannot by itself explain the entire end of Minoan power. The Santorini theory therefore works best as possible inspiration, not identification. Plato did not need an exact report of Thera to use echoes of an island catastrophe. Stories of ancient destruction can survive in altered forms. Yet there is no clear chain of transmission from the eruption to Solon, Sais, or Plato. The connection remains plausible in atmosphere and uncertain in evidence. Crete itself has also been called Atlantis. The Minoans built large palace centers at Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros. They created complex art, long-distance trade routes, and administrative systems using scripts that included linear A, which remains undeciphered. Their ships crossed the eastern Mediterranean. Their religious imagery featured bulls, sacred spaces, and dramatic ceremonies. To early 20th century observers, the discovery of Minoan civilization felt like the recovery of a lost world. Here was a sophisticated island culture nearly forgotten by later history. It was easy to see Atlantis in the painted halls and labyrinthine architecture. Yet the temptation reveals something important about the search. Atlantis often appears wherever archaeology uncovers a civilization more complex than modern people expected. The surprise becomes evidence. When Troy was found to have real archaeological layers, some concluded that every ancient legend must hide a literal city. When Minoan Crete emerged from excavation, it became Atlantis. When underwater settlements were discovered, they became Atlantis. When satellite images revealed circular geology in the Sahara, Atlantis moved there. The story follows astonishment. But real archaeology demands more than astonishment. A valid identification would need to explain the location, date, scale, culture, political structure, destruction, and transmission of Plato's account. It would also need independent evidence that does not begin by assuming Plato was describing a real place. No proposed site satisfies all of those conditions. That has not stopped the search. Some investigators move Atlantis closer to the Strait of Gibraltar, focusing on southern Spain. The ancient region contained rich cultures, including Tartessos, known to Greek and Phoenician writers as a wealthy society connected with metals and trade. Marshlands around the lower Guadalquivir River have repeatedly attracted attention. A major tsunami or earthquake could have devastated coastal settlements there. From time to time, geometric features seen in aerial or satellite images are announced as traces of a ringed city. Southern Spain has several advantages as a candidate. It lies near the Pillars of Heracles. It belonged to the far western edge of the world known to ancient Greeks. It possessed mineral wealth. Its coasts and river systems were vulnerable to change. Tartessos later became mysterious because its political centers and identity remained incompletely understood. But the evidence again falls short. Natural formations, agricultural patterns, canals, and later human structures can create circles and lines from above. Excavation is required to establish dates and functions. Even if a wealthy settlement destroyed by flooding is found, that would not prove it was Plato's continent-sized empire. Western Iberia may have contributed colors to the legend, but no confirmed Atlantean capital has emerged from the marshes. Another candidate lies much farther west, the Azores. These volcanic islands rise from the mid-Atlantic ridge. Because they sit in the ocean beyond Gibraltar, they appear to match Plato's direction. 19th century writers imagined that the islands were mountain peaks left behind after a continent sank. Modern geology changed the picture. The floor of the Atlantic is not the wreckage of a recently submerged continent. It records the long process of seafloor spreading. New oceanic crust forms along the mid-Atlantic ridge and moves outward. Continents do not simply plunge intact beneath the waves in a day and a night. Large regions can flood, coastlines can sink, volcanic islands can collapse, and landslides can generate enormous tsunamis. But a continent-sized landmass in the central Atlantic could not have disappeared around 9,600 before Christ without leaving unmistakable geological evidence. The Atlantic preserves no such event. This does not make the ocean harmless. Volcanic islands can suffer catastrophic flank collapses. Earthquakes can lower coastal land. Tsunamis can erase settlements. During the end of the Ice Age, rising seas drowned vast areas once occupied by human beings. The English Channel, the North Sea, the Persian Gulf, and coastlines around the world contain landscapes that were dry land when hunter-gatherers walked across them. There are real lost worlds beneath the sea, but none requires a vanished Atlantic continent. The difference matters because Atlantis has often been used to collapse every drowned landscape into one story. Doggerland beneath the North Sea becomes Atlantis. The Black Sea flood becomes Atlantis. A submerged ruin near India becomes Atlantis. The name becomes so flexible that it no longer identifies anything. A theory that can explain every place explains no place. Still, the drowned landscapes of the Ice Age help us understand why Plato's date feels haunting. Around the time he places Atlantis, global sea levels were rising as ice sheets melted. Human communities did lose hunting grounds, river valleys, and coasts. Oral memories of flooding may have survived for long periods in some cultures. Could a memory from the end of the Ice Age have reached Plato? It is not impossible in the broadest sense. Human stories can preserve the shape of real events. But preserving a specific political empire, a named dynasty, exact city measurements, and a war with an impossible Athens across 9,000 years would require evidence far beyond what we possess. The date may accidentally overlap a real age of flooding. Or Plato may have chosen extreme antiquity because it made his invention impossible to challenge. No Greek historian could correct an event everyone had forgotten. No surviving witness could dispute the dimensions. The further Atlantis receded into the past, the more perfectly it could serve the present. The first people to inherit Atlantis were not explorers. They were philosophers, Plato's students. And later commentators approached the story through the problems raised by the Timaeus and Critias. Was the account literal history? Was it an invented example? Was it both, a story built from real events but reshaped for philosophical use? Ancient opinions were not uniform. A later tradition attributes to Aristotle the view that Plato created Atlantis and then destroyed it, much as a poet might remove a device once it had served its purpose. The exact wording survives only through later authors, so it must be treated carefully. Yet the idea fits a long-standing ancient suspicion that the island was a literary construction. Another early figure, Cranther, wrote a commentary on Plato's Timaeus in the centuries after Plato's death. His work is lost. What we know comes largely through Proclus, a philosopher writing many centuries later. Proclus reports that Egyptian priests said the story was preserved on pillars. Modern readers have often treated this as independent confirmation that Cranther saw Egyptian records himself. The surviving evidence does not justify that confidence. We do not possess Cranther's text. We do not know exactly what he believed, what sources he used, or whether Proclus understood him correctly. The Egyptian pillars have never been identified. The report may show that some ancient Platonists accepted a historical foundation, but it does not provide archaeological proof. Other ancient writers referred to islands in the Atlantic, distant lands, or stories of catastrophic floods. These references are often gathered into lists as though each one supports Atlantis. Usually they do not. Ancient geography contained many imagined or poorly known places, islands of the blessed, lands of giants, western paradises, and continents beyond the familiar world. Similarity of direction is not identity. For the Greeks and Romans, the Atlantic was a boundary of knowledge. Beyond the pillars of Heracles lay dangerous waters and uncertain geography. Phoenician and Carthaginian sailors traveled far beyond the strait, but their routes were not fully known to Greek writers. Reports of islands, currents, fog, seaweed, and distant coasts reached the Mediterranean through incomplete chains of information. The Western Ocean became the perfect space for possibility. Atlantis belonged to that edge, but it did not dominate ancient imagination the way it dominates ours. Plato's story was known, discussed, and copied, yet it remained a small part of a much larger philosophical legacy. Readers of the Timaeus were often more interested in the creation of the cosmos, the nature of the soul, or the mathematical order of matter. Atlantis was the dramatic prelude, not the center of the work. As the classical world changed, the island receded. The Western Roman Empire collapsed. Greek philosophical texts became less accessible in Latin Europe. The Timaeus survived in partial Latin translation and commentary, but the Critias had a narrower path. Atlantis did not vanish completely, yet for centuries it was not the universal lost civilization of modern fantasy. Other stories carried the emotional weight of destruction. The biblical flood shaped medieval Christian ideas about the ancient world. Tales of drowned kingdoms appeared in local traditions. Cities such as Ys in Brittany, Canterbury Gwynedd in Wales, and Veneta along the Baltic coast were said to have disappeared beneath the sea because of sin, pride, broken promises, or divine punishment. These legends developed in different places and times, but they reveal a recurring human image. A wealthy city ignores a warning. The water rises. The bells can still be heard beneath the waves. Atlantis is part of that larger family of stories, but its route into modern fame required a new age of maps. During the Renaissance, Greek texts returned more widely to Western Europe. Scholars translated Plato into Latin. Humanists reconsidered ancient philosophy. At the same time, European navigators crossed the Atlantic and encountered continents unknown to classical geographers. The old boundary had opened. The Pillars of Heracles were no longer the edge of the world. Ships passed through Gibraltar and sailed toward the Azores, Africa, and the Americas. Suddenly, Plato's claim that lands existed beyond the Atlantic seemed less impossible. The discovery of the Americas encouraged some writers to ask whether the new continents were connected to Atlantis. This was not a harmless question. European thinkers often tried to fit indigenous peoples into biblical and classical histories that centered Europe and the Mediterranean. Instead of recognizing that American civilizations had developed through their own long histories, some proposed that their achievements must have come from outsiders: Phoenicians, Israelites, Egyptians, or Atlanteans. Atlantis became a tool for denying invention to real peoples. That pattern would grow more dangerous in later centuries. Still, Renaissance and early modern writers also used Atlantis openly as fiction. Thomas More's Utopia, published in 1516, described an imagined island society in order to examine European politics, religion, property, and justice. More did not need readers to believe the island physically existed. Its distance allowed him to criticize the world around him. A century later, Francis Bacon wrote New Atlantis. His unfinished work tells of European sailors reaching the fictional island of Ben Salem in the Pacific. There they encounter a society organized around learning, investigation, and an institution devoted to the study of nature. Bacon's title deliberately invoked Plato, but the point was not to locate a drowned city. It was to imagine a future built through knowledge. This is one of the great ironies of the tradition. Atlantis began as a philosophical story about political order. Some of its most important successors understood that. They created new islands to think about ideal societies. But another current was forming. Mapmakers filled unknown spaces with possibilities. Scholars compared myths from different continents. Explorers searched for ancient origins. The growth of geology challenged traditional chronologies of the Earth. Fossils, strata, volcanoes, and extinct animals revealed a planet shaped by immense changes. If mountains could rise and seas could retreat, perhaps continents could vanish. Before modern plate tectonics, this was not always an absurd idea. Scientists debated how the Earth's surface had formed. Some proposed lost land bridges to explain the distribution of plants and animals. Others imagined sunken continents connecting separated regions. The Atlantic floor was poorly mapped. Depths were uncertain. A writer could place a drowned landmass in the ocean and claim science had not yet ruled it out. Atlantis moved from philosophy into speculation. In the 17th and 18th centuries, scholars proposed locations in the Atlantic, Africa, Scandinavia, the Americas, and even the Arctic. Some interpreted ancient mythology as distorted history. Others tried to identify a single homeland from which civilization had spread. This desire for one origin was powerful. Why did pyramidal structures appear in different parts of the world? Why did many cultures have flood stories? Why did distant peoples observe the stars, build monuments, cultivate crops, and create writing systems? The modern answer is complex. Human beings confront similar environments. They solve similar engineering problems. Ideas also travel through contact, migration, trade, and conquest. Different societies can independently invent agriculture, monumental architecture, calendars, and political hierarchies. Similarity does not require one lost teacher, but a single vanished civilization offered a more dramatic explanation. Atlantis became the missing parent of history. It could be made responsible for Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Maya, the builders of megaliths, the origins of language, the invention of metallurgy, and almost anything else an author wanted to connect. The less evidence available, the more flexible the island became. By the 19th century, the stage was ready for the man who would turn Plato's brief story into a global theory. His name was Ignatius Donnelly. He was not an archaeologist. He was a lawyer, writer, reformer, and American politician from Minnesota. He served in Congress and became involved in populist causes. He was brilliant, energetic, imaginative, and convinced that enormous patterns could be found across history. In 1882, he published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. The book changed the legend more than almost any work since Plato. Donnelly began with a series of propositions. Atlantis, he argued, had been a real island in the Atlantic Ocean. Plato's description was essentially true. The island was the place where humanity first rose from barbarism to civilization. Atlanteans invented agriculture, navigation, religion, metallurgy, and writing. Colonists from Atlantis spread across the world, founding civilizations in Egypt, Europe, Asia, and the Americas. The gods of ancient peoples were distorted memories of Atlantean rulers. Flood traditions preserved the destruction of the island. It was a magnificent structure built from weak foundations. Donnelly gathered similarities in architecture, language, myth, and symbolism. He compared pyramids on different continents. He linked legends of deluge. He used the limited geology of his time to argue that the mid-Atlantic ridge was the skeleton of a sunken landmass. He presented coincidence as inheritance and possibility as probability. To readers living in an age of rapid discovery, the argument felt modern. Archaeologists had revealed ancient cities. Explorers were mapping the world. Geologists were proving the Earth was far older than traditional chronology suggested. Darwinian evolution had transformed debates about human origins. Telegraph cables and ocean soundings were exposing the hidden structure of the seas. Atlantis no longer appeared only as myth. It appeared as a scientific mystery waiting for the right evidence. Donnelly's book became enormously influential. It offered a complete system, easy to understand and difficult to disprove, because every missing piece could be explained as something destroyed in the catastrophe. If cultures resembled one another, that proved Atlantean contact. If they did not resemble one another, time and distance had changed them. If no Atlantean artifacts survived, the ocean had erased them. If traditions differed, they had been corrupted through memory. The theory could absorb every objection. That was its greatest strength as a story and its greatest weakness as history. Donnelly's Atlantis was not merely a city. It was a solution to everything. That made it irresistible. Readers who felt that conventional history was too narrow could enter a world in which every myth was a fragment, every unexplained monument was a clue, and every civilization descended from a forgotten age of greatness. The theory turned history into a detective story with one master key. But the key also carried the assumptions of its time. 19th century writers often arranged human societies on false racial ladders. They treated European civilization as the standard and struggled to accept that indigenous peoples in Africa, Asia, Oceania, and the Americas had created complex states, sciences, and architecture through their own ingenuity. A lost white or supposedly superior founding race became a convenient explanation for achievements that prejudice refused to credit to the people who actually built them. Atlantis was repeatedly placed inside that framework. This is not a small side effect of the legend. It is part of its modern history. Claims that Egyptians could not have built the pyramids, that the Maya could not have developed writing and astronomy, or that Andean peoples could not have engineered monumental stonework do not honor ancient civilizations. They erase them. They replace generations of human labor, experimentation, adaptation, and knowledge with an imaginary outsider. Donnelly did not create every version of that idea, but his book gave it an influential new form. Others pushed Atlantis even farther from Plato. In the late 19th century, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and the Theosophical movement described vast cycles of human development involving lost continents and so-called root races. Atlantis became part of an occult prehistory filled with spiritual evolution, psychic powers, and successive human types. These teachings were not archaeological arguments. They were religious and esoteric claims presented as hidden wisdom. Later occult writers expanded the story with aircraft, energy weapons, crystals, and supernatural technologies. The Atlanteans became either enlightened masters or destroyers who misused forbidden science. The moral patterns still resembled Plato. Power corrupted and catastrophe followed, but the details were now almost entirely modern. In the early 20th century, some racial nationalists and occult ideologues in Europe absorbed lost continent myths into fantasies of ancient Aryan origins. Atlantis, Thule, and Hyperborea were mixed with invented racial histories. Certain later Nazi-associated writers treated these legends as evidence of a vanished northern master race. The connection is often exaggerated in popular retellings, as though the entire Nazi state was built around a search for Atlantis. It was not. Nazi ideology depended on modern racism, nationalism, conquest, and anti-Semitism, not on Plato's island. Yet some individuals and institutions within that world did promote pseudo-archaeological expeditions and myths designed to prove racial superiority. Atlantis could be recruited because it had become empty enough to hold almost anything. A warning about imperial arrogance was transformed into a fantasy of racial inheritance. The inversion could not have been more complete. Another influential version came from Edgar Cayce, an American psychic known as the Sleeping Prophet. During trance readings in the first half of the 20th century, Cayce described Atlantis as a technologically advanced civilization that possessed powerful crystals and suffered a series of destructions. He predicted that records of Atlantis would be found near Egypt and that parts of the lost world would rise near Bimini in the Bahamas. When unusual stone formations became widely known off Bimini in 1968, believers saw confirmation. The formation, called the Bimini Road, consists of large blocks of beach rock arranged in lines beneath shallow water. From above, it can resemble a paved road, harbor wall, or collapsed structure. Geologists studying the site have generally concluded that the blocks formed naturally as beach rock fractured along joints and was later submerged by rising sea level. To believers, the regular shapes looked too deliberate. To geologists, regularity was not surprising. Natural processes create hexagonal basalt columns, nearly spherical stones, straight fractures, layered terraces, and circles. The human mind is exceptionally good at recognizing design, even where design does not exist. Bimini reveals the central conflict in almost every Atlantis search. Appearance creates the question. Context provides the answer. A stone block alone tells little. Archaeologists ask whether it was cut, moved, joined, dated, and associated with tools, pottery, food remains, burials, inscriptions, or structures. A wall belongs to a settlement. A harbor belongs to an economy. A city leaves layers of ordinary life. Atlantis hunters often begin with the extraordinary shape and work outward. Archaeology begins with the material context and works inward. The difference is slow, unglamorous, and essential. Atlantis flourished in the 20th century because new technologies repeatedly promised a breakthrough. Sonar revealed mountains and trenches beneath the ocean. Submarines reached greater depths. Aircraft photographed remote terrain. Satellites mapped deserts and forests. Each new view of the Earth exposed patterns no one had seen before. And each pattern invited a claim. A grid on the seafloor became streets. A seamount became a pyramid. A circular desert formation became a ringed capital. A volcanic terrace became a temple platform. Blurry images did the work that missing evidence could not. The ocean encouraged this imagination because most of it remained unseen. People looked at maps and saw blank blue space. Beneath that blue lay mountain chains, canyons, volcanoes, plains, shipwrecks, and drowned coastlines. It seemed reasonable that a city might be waiting there. Cities do wait beneath water. Heraclean and Canopus, ancient Egyptian settlements near the Nile Delta, were discovered submerged beneath the Mediterranean. Pavlopetri in Greece preserves the plan of a Bronze Age town under shallow water. Port Royal in Jamaica sank partly after an earthquake in 1692. Baiae, a Roman resort near Naples, was gradually submerged by volcanic ground movement. Ancient remains lie beneath lakes, rivers, reservoirs, and seas around the world. These discoveries prove that cities can drown. They do not prove Atlantis. In fact, they show what real submerged archaeology looks like. There are walls, streets, anchors, pottery, inscriptions, statues, bones, coins, and datable layers. The sites fit known historical cultures even when their preservation is extraordinary. They are not isolated shapes waiting to be named. They are human environments connected to surrounding evidence. The discovery of Troy is often used as a defense of Atlantis. For centuries, many readers treated Homer's Iliad as legend. In the 19th century, Heinrich Schliemann excavated at Hisarlik in modern Turkey and uncovered a sequence of cities at a location now widely accepted as ancient Troy. The discovery demonstrated that epic tradition can preserve memories of real places and conflicts. But Troy also teaches caution. Schliemann was reckless. He dug through important layers, misidentified treasures, and forced complex evidence into the story he expected to find. Modern archaeology has produced a far more careful picture. There was not one Troy, but many settlements rebuilt over centuries. The relationship between archaeological destruction layers and Homer's poem remains debated. The lesson is not that every legend is literally true. The lesson is that texts and archaeology must be compared without allowing either one to silence the other. Plato's Atlantis differs from Troy in a crucial way. Troy appears in multiple traditions connected to a real region already known to the ancient Greeks. Atlantis appears first in Plato's philosophical dialogues with a geography, date, and political purpose that create major contradictions. Searching for inspiration is reasonable. Treating every new site as confirmation is not. Popular culture cared little for those distinctions. Novelists, filmmakers, comic artists, game designers, and television producers transformed Atlantis into an underwater kingdom, a scientific utopia, an alien colony, a magical empire, or a surviving civilization hidden beneath the sea. Jules Verne sent Captain Nemo through ruins identified as Atlantis in 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas. Arthur Conan Doyle imagined a surviving prehistoric world connected to the Atlantic imagination. Later stories gave Atlantis domes, submarines, energy beams, crystals, and citizens adapted to life underwater. The visual language became fixed. Great columns covered in coral, statues staring through green water, schools of fish moving through empty palaces, a crown lying in sand. None of this appears in Plato. His Atlantis did not continue beneath the waves. He never described survivors breathing underwater. There were no crystal engines or futuristic machines. Yet the underwater city became more famous than the original island because it answered the question Plato left open. What happened after it sank? Fiction refused to accept silence. It populated the ruins. By the late 20th century, Atlantis existed in two parallel worlds. In scholarship, it was usually treated as a Platonic myth, perhaps drawing on real historical memories. In popular culture, it had become the greatest archaeological mystery on Earth. The two worlds occasionally touched. A new discovery would produce headlines. A documentary would announce that the search was nearly over. Experts would point out the missing evidence. Public interest would fade. Then another candidate would appear. Atlantis was always found. Atlantis was never found. The contradiction kept the legend alive. One of the most dramatic candidates placed Atlantis beneath ice rather than water. Antarctica. The idea became popular through theories of sudden crustal displacement. In this version, Antarctica once occupied a warmer position farther north. An advanced civilization lived there until the Earth's outer shell shifted, moving the continent toward the South Pole and burying its cities beneath ice. The theory gained attention partly because Albert Einstein wrote a foreword to Charles Hapgood's 1958 book Earth's Shifting Crust. Einstein found aspects of the problem interesting, but his involvement is often presented as though he endorsed every later Atlantean claim. He did not. More importantly, plate tectonics and paleoclimate evidence do not support a sudden recent movement of Antarctica from a temperate latitude within the time of human civilization. Antarctica has not been secretly frozen only since 9600 before Christ. Its ice sheets developed over millions of years. The continent does preserve fossils from much warmer eras, including evidence of forests, but those environments existed long before modern humans. Satellite maps showing mountains beneath the ice reveal geology, not city streets. The Antarctic Atlantis survives because it offers the perfect, inaccessible ruin. Evidence is missing because it is under kilometers of ice. Expeditions cannot easily disprove every imagined structure. The very obstacle becomes protection for the theory. Another proposed site does not hide at all. It can be seen from space. In Mauritania, near the western edge of the Sahara, lies the Rikhat structure, also called the Eye of the Sahara. It is a vast circular geological formation roughly 40 kilometers across, made of concentric rings of eroded rock. From above, it looks astonishingly like a target pressed into the desert. To modern Atlantis enthusiasts, the resemblance to Plato's rings is immediate. The location lies in northwest Africa, not impossibly far from the Atlantic. Ancient waterways and environmental change affected the surrounding Sahara. Supporters point to salt deposits, regional flood evidence, nearby mountains, and artifacts showing long human occupation of the broader area. But the Rikhat structure is not the remains of a constructed city. Geologists understand it as an eroded uplift or dome shaped by deep geological processes. Its rings are rock layers exposed by erosion, not alternating engineered walls and canals. The formation is vastly older than human civilization. No archaeological evidence demonstrates that it served as the capital of a maritime empire. It is also inland and elevated, requiring additional assumptions to connect it with Plato's island and sudden submergence. The Rikhat theory illustrates how strongly geometry influences belief. Plato described circles. The desert contains circles. The mind closes the distance. Yet matching one feature while ignoring the rest is not identification. A convincing theory must explain why the site fits and why the mismatches exist. Otherwise, every circular landscape becomes Atlantis. The same problem appears with the Black Sea flood hypothesis. Thousands of years ago, the Black Sea region experienced major changes in water level. One influential theory proposed that Mediterranean water burst through the Bosporus around the 6th millennium before Christ, rapidly flooding inhabited shores and creating memories later preserved in flood myths. The details and speed of this event remain debated. Geological research has produced competing reconstructions. Some evidence supports substantial changes in salinity and sea level. The idea of a single unimaginably violent flood covering the entire basin exactly as first proposed is not universally accepted. Even if a major flood occurred, the Black Sea lies in the wrong direction for Plato's Atlantis. It is east of Greece, not beyond Gibraltar. There is no evidence of a ringed island empire leading an invasion of the Mediterranean world. The theory may contribute to the larger history of flood traditions, but it cannot simply replace Plato's geography without rewriting the text. The Sea Peoples provide another possible echo. Around 1200 before Christ, the eastern Mediterranean entered a period of severe disruption often called the Late Bronze Age collapse. Palaces burned. Trade networks fractured. Kingdoms fell or transformed. Egyptian inscriptions describe battles against groups modern scholars call the Sea Peoples, though their identities and origins remain debated. The scale of change was extraordinary. Mycenaean palace society collapsed. The Hittite Empire disappeared. Coastal cities were destroyed. Egypt survived but was weakened. Migration, warfare, political instability, drought, famine, earthquakes, and internal rebellion may all have played roles. Some writers connect the Sea Peoples to Atlantis because both involve a maritime confederation attacking lands in the eastern Mediterranean. The comparison is intriguing. Plato may have known traditions of ancient invasions from the west or sea. Egyptian temples did preserve accounts of battles against foreign coalitions, but the match is incomplete. The Egyptian inscriptions do not name Atlantis. The Sea Peoples were not described as citizens of one giant island that sank after defeat. Their campaigns occurred thousands of years later than Plato's stated date and within a known Bronze Age context. Linking the two requires selecting broad similarities while setting aside specific differences. Still, the Late Bronze Age collapse may be among the kinds of real historical memory that made Plato's story believable. Civilizations had fallen. Cities had burned. Peoples had moved across the sea. An age of palaces had ended so thoroughly that later Greeks remembered it through heroic poetry rather than continuous written history. Plato lived after a long dark gap in Greek literacy. The world of Mycenaean kings felt both ancestral and alien. Ruined walls stood across the landscape. Giant stone blocks at places such as Mycenae and Tiryns were so impressive that later Greeks called them Cyclopean, imagining that only giants could have built them. When people live among ruins they cannot fully explain, lost ages become easy to imagine. Tartessos in southern Iberia has already drawn attention because of its western location and wealth. Some theories identify it directly with Atlantis. Others suggest it preserved memories of a regional power later magnified by Plato. Greek writers associated the far west with silver, trade, and long-lived rulers. Phoenician colonies connected Iberian resources to Mediterranean markets. A catastrophe affecting Atlantic Spain could have entered maritime tradition. Tsunami deposits show that the region has experienced destructive events. The Great Lisbon earthquake of 1755 demonstrated how violently the sea could strike the coasts of Portugal, Spain, and Morocco. Earlier tsunamis also occurred. But Tartessos remains a historical culture, not a blank name waiting to become Atlantis. Its chronology belongs mainly to the first millennium before Christ. Its language, settlements, and contacts are studied through archaeology. Turning it into Plato's empire can obscure what is genuinely fascinating about it. The island of Sardinia has also been proposed. It possessed Bronze Age nuragic towers, maritime connections, metal resources, and a strategic western Mediterranean location. Catastrophic flooding affected some coastal regions. Supporters compare Sardinian archaeology with details in Plato and sometimes connect the island's peoples with the sea peoples. Once again, there may be useful questions hidden within the claim. Sardinia played an important role in Bronze Age exchange. Its societies built thousands of stone towers and participated in complex Mediterranean networks. But no evidence shows that it was the enormous island beyond Gibraltar described by Plato, or that its capital had the concentric form of Atlantis. Some researchers move the Pillars of Heracles. Instead of identifying them with Gibraltar, they argue that the name once referred to another strait or landmark inside the Mediterranean. This allows Atlantis to be placed at Santorini, Sardinia, Malta, or elsewhere. Ancient geographic terms could shift. Different authors occasionally used familiar names for different features. Yet Gibraltar is the dominant historical identification for the pillars in the context of access to the Atlantic. Relocating them mainly because a preferred Atlantis site lies elsewhere risks changing the map to save the theory. The 9,000 years create a similar pressure. A popular argument says Egyptian priests counted lunar months rather than solar years. Divide 9,000 by roughly 12, and the date moves toward a more historically comfortable period. Another suggestion claims the symbol for 100 was confused with the symbol for 1,000. Then 9,000 becomes 900, bringing the story closer to Bronze Age collapse. Or Greek history. These corrections are attractive because they solve a major problem. But there is no surviving Egyptian Atlantis document showing the original number. We cannot inspect a mistaken symbol. We cannot prove Solon converted the units incorrectly. The error is invented to make the theory work. More importantly, other numbers in the story would also need attention. If every measurement, date, and army total can be reduced whenever it becomes inconvenient, the text stops functioning as evidence. A theory must not claim Plato's authority for matching details and reject his authority for mismatching ones. There are even candidates in the Americas. After Europeans crossed the Atlantic, some writers identified Atlantis with the New World itself. Others claimed Atlantean refugees founded civilizations in Mesoamerica or the Andes. Similarities between pyramids became a central argument. But pyramids are not a mysterious global blueprint. When builders want to create a tall monument using stone or earth, a broad base narrowing upward is stable. Egyptian pyramids, Mesopotamian ziggurats, Mesoamerican temple platforms, and Andean monumental constructions differ in date, purpose, engineering, ritual use, and development. Their similarities do not erase their independent histories. No Atlantean population is required. The same is true for flood stories. Communities near rivers, coasts, monsoon regions, glacial lakes, and tsunami zones experience floods. Water destroys homes, fields, boundaries, and memory. It is unsurprising that many cultures tell stories of overwhelming water. The details often differ greatly. Some floods are global. Others are local. Some punish sin. Others explain geography, migration, kingship, or the survival of ancestors. Treating every flood narrative as a corrupted copy of Atlantis removes the meaning each story has within its own culture. Atlantis does not become stronger when it consumes every myth. It becomes impossible to test. To know what Atlantis would leave behind, imagine for a moment that Plato's account was literal. A large island existed beyond Gibraltar. It supported a population capable of constructing monumental temples, canals, bridges, walls, shipyards, baths, roads, and an immense agricultural system. Its kings controlled distant territories. Its fleets crossed the sea. Its armies invaded Europe and North Africa. Its destruction occurred near the end of the Ice Age. Such a civilization would not leave one clue. It would leave millions. Mines would scar the landscape. Quarries would contain tool marks. Harbors would trap anchors, cargo, and broken pottery. Farms would change pollen records and soil chemistry. Metallurgy would leave slag and furnaces. Human populations would leave burials, food remains, diseases, and genetic patterns. Trade would carry Atlantean objects into lands that did not sink. Conquered peoples would preserve names, weapons, artistic styles, and stories. Egyptian records would not be the only archive. A maritime empire cannot disappear only at its capital. Its edges survive. Rome fell, but Roman roads, coins, forts, laws, languages, and ruins remained across 3 continents. The Mongol Empire fragmented, but its campaigns entered chronicles written by many peoples. The Bronze Age palace systems collapsed, yet clay tablets, destroyed cities, weapons, shipwrecks, and imported goods still reveal their networks. Atlantis, as Plato describes it, would have touched too much of the world to vanish without a trace. This is why the absence of independent evidence matters. It is not an argument that archaeology has discovered everything. Far from it. Most ancient settlements have never been excavated. Coastlines contain unknown sites. Deep oceans remain difficult to survey. Important discoveries will continue, but ignorance has a shape. There is a difference between saying an undiscovered fishing village may lie beneath sediment and saying an unknown Ice Age empire with fleets, metal industries, and monumental cities controlled the Atlantic world. The larger the claim, the larger the expected footprint. Some believers answer that the catastrophe destroyed all evidence. Yet no natural disaster erases every object across an empire's entire range. Tsunamis move and bury material. Volcanoes preserve as well as destroy. Submerged sites can survive under sediment. Colonies and trade partners lie outside the central disaster zone. Total erasure is not a geological process. It is a narrative escape. The seafloor itself has been mapped with increasing precision. Oceanographic surveys show the mid-Atlantic ridge, abyssal plains, fracture zones, seamounts, and continental margins. Rock samples reveal the nature and age of the crust. Oceanic crust differs from continental crust. The Atlantic basin formed over tens of millions of years as tectonic plates moved apart. There is no continent-sized block that dropped beneath the central Atlantic 12,000 years ago. Continental fragments do exist beneath some oceans. Zealandia, mostly submerged in the southwest Pacific, is a genuine region of continental crust. Microcontinents and fragments can split during tectonic change. But these processes unfold across immense geological time, not in one day and night within human memory. This distinction is sometimes misunderstood. The existence of submerged continental crust does not make Plato's event possible. A volcanic island can collapse rapidly. A coastal plain can sink during an earthquake. Sea level can rise over generations. A tsunami can destroy a city in minutes. None of these mechanisms explains the disappearance of a landmass larger than the ancient Greeks' Libya and Asia combined. Plato's phrase also requires context. When he described Atlantis as larger than Libya and Asia, he was not using modern continental boundaries. Greek geographic terms referred to the known regions of North Africa and Asia Minor or broader, but still imperfectly defined lands. Even so, the phrase signals enormous scale. It is meant to overwhelm. Some translators and interpreters have argued that the Greek word could imply Atlantis was greater in power rather than physically larger, or that it referred to a combined network of island and mainland territories. Such readings can soften the geological problem. They do not create positive evidence for a real empire. Then there is the muddy sea. Plato says the sinking of Atlantis left a shoal of mud that made the outer ocean impassable. This detail has led some to search for shallow banks beyond Gibraltar or to connect the story with ancient sailors' fears of the Atlantic. But a continent sinking into deep water would not leave a neat surface barrier for centuries. Sediment dispersal, currents, and the shape of the ocean floor make the image difficult to treat as literal geology. As symbolism, however, it is powerful. The road to Atlantis closes behind it. The sea itself prevents return. Plato places the truth beyond the reach of verification. Archaeology has its own way of handling stories like this. Researchers separate different questions that popular accounts often combine. Did Plato invent Atlantis as a political myth? Did he borrow details from real places? Did he draw on memories of one catastrophe or several? Did later people reinterpret his story as literal history? Could an unknown settlement eventually be found that resembles part of the description? These questions do not require the same answer. Plato may have invented the island while using real earthquakes. He may have drawn on Minoan wealth without preserving a Minoan tradition. He may have shaped a Western invader from Persian, Sicilian, and Bronze Age memories. A newly discovered ringed harbor would not prove every part of the account. A failed Atlantis search would not make ancient floods imaginary. The story can contain historical materials without being a historical report. That middle ground is less dramatic than either extreme. It offers no triumphant discovery and no simple dismissal. But it is often where truth lives. Consider the city's concentric design. Circular settlements and ringed fortifications appear in many cultures. Islands naturally encourage radial growth. Moats and canals create defensive layers. Plato may have seen or heard of harbor systems with enclosed basins. He may also have chosen circles because of their symbolic perfection. In the Timaeus, geometry structures the cosmos. Atlantis begins with divine circles and ends in moral disorder. The shape may be architecture and philosophy at the same time. Consider the two springs, hot and cold. Volcanic and tectonic regions around the Mediterranean contain thermal springs beside cooler water sources. Plato knew landscapes where the earth produced heat. The detail makes Atlantis physical, but it does not identify one island. Consider the elephants. Their presence signals distance, abundance, and scale. North Africa had elephants in antiquity. Travelers told of exotic animals in outer lands. The detail could reflect geographic knowledge rather than eyewitness memory. Consider orichalcum. The mysterious metal has generated endless claims of advanced technology. Yet ancient terms for metals and alloys were not always consistent. A bright copper alloy could have seemed extraordinary, especially when used to plate walls. In Plato's moral design, the metal matters because Atlantis possesses wealth beyond necessity. The mystery of its composition should not hide its literary role. Consider the 10 kings. 5 pairs of twins divide the island into 10 realms. The symmetry is almost too perfect. Mythic genealogies often create political geography. A founding god fathers rulers, and territory becomes family. The number may reflect Greek traditions of leagues and divisions, or it may simply support the ordered structure of the tale. Every detail can be read in 2 ways: as a clue to a place, or as a piece of a philosophical machine. For more than 2,000 years, readers have preferred the map. Maps promise arrival. Philosophy demands self-examination. It is easier to ask where Atlantis sank than to ask why Plato believed powerful societies decay. The answer he gives is uncomfortable because it does not depend on one evil ruler. Atlantis declines gradually. The divine element is diluted. Wealth changes judgment. The people continue to look successful after they have lost wisdom. Outsiders envy them. They envy themselves. Their collapse begins at the height of their prosperity. There is no dramatic moment when everyone chooses corruption. There is only a slow change in what they admire. That may be the most historically accurate part of the story. Empires rarely describe themselves as greedy. They speak of security, destiny, order, civilization, honor, markets, law, or divine favor. Expansion becomes defense. Domination becomes responsibility. Wealth becomes proof that the system is good. By the time consequences arrive, the language of greatness has hidden the condition of the state. Atlantis does not see the wave because it is looking at its own reflection. This is why Plato's island can move from century to century without losing power. Every age recognizes the temptation. The ancient Athenians who first heard the story would have recognized that temptation in their own past. Athens had celebrated freedom while forcing allied cities to pay tribute. It had built magnificent monuments with resources drawn from an empire. It had punished rebellion with terrifying violence. Its citizens could look toward the Acropolis and see beauty, civic pride, religious devotion, and imperial power fused in stone. Plato did not need to name Athens as Atlantis. His audience could see the shadow. The island's location in the west also allowed a safer distance. Atlantis was foreign enough to condemn, but familiar enough to recognize. It possessed the naval strength of Athens, the royal structure of Persia, the luxury of great western cities, and the mythic ancestry of a heroic age. It was every empire and no empire. The idealized ancient Athens in the dialogue is equally revealing. Plato describes a society in which warriors live apart from farmers and craftsmen. They possess no private gold or silver. Their training, homes, and shared way of life resemble the guardian class in his republic. The land itself is harsher and more disciplined than luxurious Atlantis. One side has abundance, the other has order. This is not archaeological Athens. It is philosophy projected backward. The war allows Plato to stage a test. If his ideal state met the greatest possible empire, could it survive? The answer is yes. Not because it has more ships or more metal, but because its citizens are governed by the correct values. Then nature erases both armies, preventing the victory from becoming another source of arrogance. The structure is too elegant to ignore. Atlantis rises from a god and falls through the human weakness of its descendants. Athens rises through discipline and disappears after fulfilling its duty. One civilization possesses greatness without goodness. The other possesses goodness without lasting glory. Only the story survives. And even the story survives imperfectly. Solon hears it in Egypt, but does not complete the poem he plans to write. The tale passes through generations. Critias remembers hearing it as a child from an old man during a festival. Plato places this fragile chain of memory against the enormous scale of the event. The greatest war in human history depends on a child remembering a conversation. That is either a clever claim of authenticity or a deliberate meditation on how history becomes myth. Perhaps it is both. Memory does not preserve the past like a sealed jar. It selects. It reshapes. It connects an old fear to a new crisis. Each teller makes the story meaningful to a different audience. The Egyptian priest uses Atlantis to humble the Greeks. Solon sees material for poetry. Critias uses it to answer Socrates. Plato uses it to examine politics. Donnelly uses it to create a lost mother civilization. Occult writers use it to reveal hidden knowledge. Nationalists use it to invent ancestry. Filmmakers use it to build underwater wonder. Modern searchers use it to challenge academic authority. Atlantis changes because the need for Atlantis changes. In an age of empire, it warns of empire. In an age of exploration, it becomes an undiscovered continent. In an age of machines, it becomes a technological superpower. In an age of nuclear fear, it destroys itself with forbidden energy. In an age of satellite images, it becomes a pattern seen from orbit. In an age of distrust, the absence of evidence becomes evidence of a cover-up. The island sinks into whatever anxiety lies deepest beneath the culture searching for it. This does not make the search meaningless. The search for Atlantis has sometimes led people toward real discoveries. Interest in submerged landscapes has supported underwater archaeology. Questions about ancient disasters have encouraged study of tsunamis, volcanoes, and cultural memory. The legend attracts public attention to Plato, the Minoans, Bronze Age trade, the geology of the Atlantic, and the vulnerability of coastal cities. Curiosity is not the enemy. The danger begins when curiosity refuses correction. A good mystery becomes stronger when evidence changes it. A weak theory protects itself by declaring every objection part of the mystery. Atlantis deserves better than that. It does not need false certainty to remain powerful. Imagine the final day again, but this time stay as close as possible to what Plato actually gives us. There is an empire corrupted by wealth. There is a war against Athens. There is defeat. There are earthquakes and floods. There is one terrible day and night. Everything else, The wave, the crowded harbor, the falling statues, the last king, is reconstruction. It may help us feel the story, but it is not preserved history. What Plato preserved is colder. Atlantis sinks in a sentence. That speed may be the point. The city required generations to build. Forests were cut. Stone was quarried. Canals were dug. Temples were plated. Laws were written. Armies were organized. Ships were launched. Territories were conquered. Wealth accumulated until the rulers mistook possession for permanence. Then the grammar changes. The empire is gone. Human beings measure power in years, monuments, borders, and dynasties. Nature measures nothing. The sea does not care how long a wall took to build. An earthquake does not pause before a palace because kings live inside it. The story frightens us because the scale of human achievement does not alter the fragility of the ground beneath it. That fear was not abstract in the ancient Mediterranean. In 464 before Christ, a major earthquake struck Sparta and helped trigger revolt among the Helots. In 426, earthquakes and tsunamis affected parts of Greece. Helike vanished in 373. Thera's eruption remained written into the landscape. Coastal communities knew that calm water could become violent and that the gods, as they understood them, could overturn a city without warning. We know the mechanisms differently. Tectonic plates move. Faults rupture. Volcanoes pressurize. Seafloors shift. Waves carry energy across oceans. Rising seas threaten low coasts. The explanation has changed, but the vulnerability has not. Modern civilization is more powerful than anything Plato imagined. Cities contain millions of people. Ports connect global trade. Cables on the ocean floor carry information between continents. Satellites guide ships. Engineers monitor volcanoes and design buildings to withstand earthquakes. Forecasting can save lives. Yet our systems are also concentrated and interdependent. A disaster in one region can disrupt supply chains across the world. Coastal megacities stand near faults, deltas, storms, and rising water. Wealth creates protection for some and exposure for others. Technology reduces danger while creating new forms of confidence. Atlantis remains modern because it asks whether capability has grown faster than wisdom. Plato would have recognized the question. He would not have recognized crystal engines, alien teachers, or laser weapons. But he would have understood a society proud of its power, convinced of its exceptional status, and unwilling to see moral failure beneath material success. For him, the lost technology of Atlantis was never the mystery. The lost virtue was. This is why the ending of the Critias matters so much. Zeus looks down and sees corruption. He gathers the gods. He prepares to punish Atlantis so that the people may become more measured. The sentence stops. Perhaps Plato abandoned the dialogue because another project demanded his attention. Perhaps the ending was lost before copies spread. Perhaps he died before completing it. Perhaps the break was deliberate, leaving the audience to understand the punishment from the Timaeus. We cannot know. But the unfinished scene gives the reader an unexpected responsibility. We must decide what Zeus would say. Would he condemn the kings for war? For greed? For breaking divine law? For mistaking their empire for something eternal? Or would the punishment be aimed not at wealth itself, but at the inability to use wealth without becoming possessed by it? The silence turns the judgment outward. Atlantis is no longer only on trial. The listener is. That may be why locating the island has become such an obsession. A physical ruin would be easier to confront than a moral mirror. We could photograph it, date it, map it, and place it safely in the past. A fictional Atlantis cannot be buried so easily. It can rise anywhere. Every civilization that believes collapse is impossible begins to resemble it. Every ruler who treats law as decoration enters its palace. Every empire that calls appetite destiny sails from its harbor. Every society that confuses price with value adds another layer of metal to its walls. Then comes the harder question. If Atlantis was invented, does that make it less important? No. Fiction can shape history more powerfully than forgotten fact. Plato's island influenced explorers, philosophers, politicians, mystics, archaeologists, novelists, and filmmakers. It affected how people interpreted real civilizations. It inspired beautiful art and harmful racial myths. It helped create modern pseudo-history. It became a symbol shared across languages and centuries. Atlantis may never have existed as land. It undeniably existed as an idea. And ideas leave ruins of their own. They appear in books, maps, expeditions, monuments, movies, and beliefs. They influence where people search and what they expect to find. They determine whose achievements receive credit and whose histories are erased. They can guide curiosity or distort it. The complete story of Atlantis is therefore not the biography of one island. It is the history of a transformation. A philosopher creates a Western empire to test an ideal state. Ancient commentators debate whether it was true. Medieval readers preserve fragments of Plato while other drowned city legends grow. Renaissance exploration reopens the Atlantic. Utopian writers borrow the island as a stage for political thought. 19th century speculation turns it into the source of civilization. Occult movements fill it with secret powers. Racial ideologues steal it for invented ancestry. 20th century media place it under the sea. Modern technology discovers shapes, and each shape becomes another possible capital. At every stage, Atlantis reveals less about the ancient Atlantic than about the people looking into it. The search is a mirror placed on the ocean. And still, one possibility continues to pull at the imagination. What if Plato knew something? Not everything. Not a continent exactly as he described it, but a fragment. A story of an island destroyed. A memory of a Western war. An Egyptian record of invaders from the sea. A sailor's account of shoals beyond Gibraltar. A tale carried from Thera after ash darkened the sky. A warning born at Helike after water covered the streets. What if these separate memories reached him like broken pieces of pottery? Plato may have arranged them into a vessel that never existed in that form. The pieces could be real even if the vessel was new. This is the most reasonable space left for historical Atlantis. Not a single hidden supercivilization. A composite. Real disasters, real empires, real harbors, real pride, and real human fear fused into one unforgettable island. Such an Atlantis cannot be found in one excavation. Its ruins are scattered across the ancient world. They lie at Akrotiri beneath volcanic ash, at Helike beneath layers of flood sediment, in the wreckage of Athens' Sicilian expedition, in Egyptian reliefs showing battles against peoples from the sea, in the collapsed palaces of the late Bronze Age, in Plato's memory of a city that executed Socrates and called itself wise. None of these places is Atlantis. Together, they may help explain why Atlantis feels true. A powerful myth does not need to preserve one event. It can preserve a pattern. Prosperity becomes arrogance. Arrogance becomes aggression. Aggression invites resistance. Nature and history complete the fall. The pattern repeats because human beings repeat it. That is the treasure Atlantis carried through time. Not orichalcum. Not crystals. Not machines. A warning. Perhaps this is why every expedition begins with hope and ends with another question. A research vessel crosses the Atlantic and maps a hidden mountain. The shape is dramatic, but the rock is volcanic and millions of years old. Divers descend near an island and find blocks arranged like a road. The stones are real, but the joints are natural. Satellites reveal rings in a desert. The rings are immense, but they were formed by geology long before the first city. Archaeologists uncover a drowned settlement in the Mediterranean. It is exactly the kind of discovery Atlantis seekers dreamed of, yet its pottery gives it another name and another history. The world refuses to provide Plato's island. Instead, it offers something richer. Thousands of real lost places. Settlements abandoned when rivers changed course. Ports drowned as land subsided. Villages buried by eruptions. Palaces burned during invasions. Islands emptied by famine. Coastal plains consumed by rising seas. Cultures remembered only through objects whose languages we cannot yet read. History is filled with Atlantean moments. They are smaller than the legend and more human. At Akrotiri, someone stacked furniture before leaving a damaged house, perhaps preparing to return after the earthquakes ended. They never came back. At Pompeii, a family carried jewelry and keys while ash fell from Vesuvius. At Port Royal, streets dropped into the harbor within minutes. Along Ice Age coasts, generations watched shorelines move inland and familiar hunting grounds disappear beneath water. No single one of these places is Plato's Atlantis, but each gives weight to the fear beneath it. A home can become a ruin before its owner understands that the ordinary day has ended. Plato enlarged that fear until it reached the size of an empire. The kings of Atlantis inherited a land that seemed to contain every advantage. They had metals, forests, fields, springs, animals, ships, and defensible harbors. Their capital was protected by circles established by a god. Their law stood on a pillar inside the sacred temple. Their rulers were bound by blood and ceremony. Their people could look in every direction and see proof of success. Nothing was missing except restraint. And once restraint disappeared, every advantage became part of the danger. The ships carried invasion. The wealth financed appetite. The walls protected rulers from truth. The divine ancestry became an excuse for superiority. The empire's greatest resources accelerated its greatest weakness. This is why Atlantis had to be beautiful. A ruined and miserable kingdom would teach nothing. Plato needed a civilization worth envying. The audience had to desire its abundance before recognizing the corruption beneath it. Only then could the destruction feel like more than punishment. It became a revelation. The things that make a society impressive are not always the things that make it good. A city may master water and fail to master desire. It may measure fields and misjudge justice. It may command oceans and lose command of itself. By the time the earth begins to move, the final disaster has already happened. The rulers no longer know what they are. So was Atlantis real? The most historically responsible answer is that there is no convincing evidence for the vast island empire described by Plato. The story appears first in his dialogues. Its chronology conflicts with archaeology. Its geography and scale conflict with geology. Its ancient Athens resembles Plato's political ideal rather than an Ice Age society. Its details serve a clear philosophical purpose. Yet saying Atlantis was probably invented does not reduce the mystery to nothing. We still do not know every experience Plato transformed. We do not know whether stories of Helike, Thera, Bronze Age collapse, Egyptian wars, Western trade, or lost coastal lands reached him in forms now vanished. We do not know why the Critias stops where it does. We do not know whether the final punishment was unwritten or lost. And we have not mapped every human settlement beneath the seas. New discoveries will come. A forgotten port may emerge from sediment. A shipwreck may reveal trade routes no one expected. An undeciphered text may preserve a disaster unknown to Greek history. A submerged Stone Age landscape may show communities more organized than archaeologists once imagined. But discovery will not need the name Atlantis to matter. That may be the final lesson of the search. The desire to find one spectacular lost civilization can blind us to the real civilizations already waiting to be understood. The past is not empty until a legendary empire fills it. It is crowded with people whose names disappeared, but whose work remains in terraces, tools, bones, seeds, walls, and stories. They do not need an Atlantean teacher. They need attention. Plato's island survives because it stands at the border between evidence and desire. Evidence asks what the text is, when it was written, what the rocks show, and what artifacts can support. Desire asks what might still be hidden. The best history does not destroy either impulse. It lets desire begin the journey and evidence decide where the journey can go. Without imagination, no one searches. Without discipline, every shadow becomes a city. And so Atlantis remains where it has always been most powerful, just beyond the known world. For Plato's audience, that meant beyond the pillars of Heracles. For Renaissance sailors, it meant across an unmapped ocean. For 19th century readers, it meant beneath poorly charted seas. For modern viewers, it may mean under ice, under sand, or hidden inside data no one has interpreted correctly. The boundary moves. Atlantis moves with it. Perhaps one day an expedition will announce the discovery of a circular harbor beneath the ocean. Perhaps walls will be mapped, pottery recovered, and dates established. The world will hold its breath. The name Atlantis will appear before archaeologists have completed their first season. Then the difficult work will begin. What did the people call themselves? When did they live? How did they build? Whom did they trade with? Why was the site abandoned? Does any inscription connect it to Plato? Most likely, the answers will reveal a real culture more complicated than the legend placed upon it. That would not be a disappointment. It would be history. Until then, the oldest Atlantis we can actually reach remains inside a conversation written in Athens more than 2 millennia ago. 4 men gather to discuss an ideal society. One offers an ancient tale. A lawgiver hears it from a priest. A child remembers it from an old relative. A philosopher gives the island rings, kings, medals, armies, and a fatal hunger for power. Then he brings Zeus to the edge of judgment and stops. The silence after that unfinished sentence has lasted longer than any empire. It survived the fall of Greek city-states and the rise of Rome. It survived the destruction of libraries, the crossing of oceans, the birth of modern science, and the mapping of the seafloor. It survived every confident announcement that Atlantis had finally been found. Because Atlantis was never only a place. It was the moment a civilization looked invincible and became vulnerable. It was the distance between wealth and wisdom. It was the night when walls built over generations faced a force that did not recognize kings. It was the memory of every city that believed tomorrow was guaranteed. Return one last time to the harbor. The water is pulling away. Ships lean into the mud. People step forward to stare at the exposed floor, not yet understanding that the retreating sea is not an escape. Behind them, the temple shines with gold and silver. Above them, statues of rulers watch from stone. Beyond the walls, the fields stretch across the plain, divided into perfect lines. Everything appears ordered. Everything appears permanent. Then someone sees the horizon. The darkness is rising. In that final moment, Atlantis is not ancient. It is every age that trusted power more than wisdom. Every age that believed consequences belonged to someone else. Every age that heard the warning and admired the walls instead. The wave reaches the outer ring. The bridges disappear. The royal island shakes. And by morning, the greatest empire the world had never seen has become the most famous ruin no one has ever found. Maybe Atlantis is still waiting beneath the ocean. Or maybe Plato hid it somewhere far more dangerous. Inside us, was Atlantis a memory of a real disaster, a masterpiece of political warning, or both at once?